Well, firstly, she was the mistress of Joseph Cranmer at this stage. But dealing with him first, he was a monster, obviously, but he was a realist, and he knew the chips were down and that there was no way out for him. So he was straightforward and in interrogation told us just more or less how things were. Now, Irma Grese was a very different cup of tea altogether, because she had been the female camp commandant at Auschwitz and was, of course, well known there for her exceptional cruelty. She really was the worst human being I have ever met or am ever likely to meet. And she fled from Auschwitz when the Russians were about to overrun the place and came to Belsen, where, as I say, she became the camp commandant's mistress and therefore the female camp commandant. And she showed no emotion at all. She was cruel to the nth degree. And when I interrogated her, the brigadier, I said, "What do you want me to ask her?" And he said, "Ask her if she had her time over again, would she do this, or what would be her attitude?" So I asked her this, and she wouldn't reply. She just sat in a chair and wouldn't reply. So he said, "Keep on asking her." And I asked her, I'd say about 3 times. And she didn't reply at all. Then suddenly leapt to her feet, gave the Heil Hitler salute, and called out Heil Hitler, and then sat down, refused to answer anything. So you would say she had no remorse whatsoever. And I believe when she was hung by Albert Pierpoint, who was over there after we had been to Belsen to execute a large number of the guards there. Even when he put the bag over her head, she showed not a whittle of emotion. So these are the sort of people one can find in a nation, I guess. We were, frankly, shocked to find how far ahead of us they were. Wind tunnels, to start with. In the whole of the Allied aviation world, there wasn't a single supersonic wind tunnel. And this is where we were lucky, the country had been divided into occupation zones. This was done before this capitulation. And we had a zone rich in research centres. The main aviation research centres were in the British zone. And the one at Fulkenrode had 3 supersonic wind tunnels. And it was quite astonishing. But later on, when I say supersonic, they were just supersonic, about 1.1, 1.2 Mach number. But down in Bavaria, we were alerted that there was a wind tunnel there which had been originally in Peenemünde for Werner von Braun. He had it built. And when we looked at it, it had been removed from Peenemünde because of the bombing there. And this had an airstream of Mach 4.4. Quite incredible. And also the airstream was heated in order to give true supersonic results. So this had been started to being built in 1939. So they were just streets ahead of us in this area. And if I think things had gone on unabated a bit further, I do think Germany would have been the first to have broken the sound barrier, because they had a project which was at the DFS, which was the gliding school. It wasn't a glider, but they did a lot of work on streamlined bodies, and it was being built by Arado, the manufacturer, and it was so far advanced that the Russians realized that they must have been very near ready to go supersonic. They took 50 of the Arado scientists working on it, plus the pilot, lock, stock and barrel, and the airplane back to Russia, and kept them for years. And we believe there is a possibility that the aircraft did go supersonic, but the Russians would never admit it because, of course, it was flown by a German pilot. Now that's a bit of guesswork, but based on some pretty good information. The Me-262, without any question, was the most formidable aircraft of World War II. For this reason, it had a lot of innovatory features and a quantum jump in performance. The innovatory features were, of course, primarily swept-back wings. Secondly, axial flow jet engine. Thirdly, very heavy firepower, 4 30mm cannon. Strangely enough, it had no ejection seat fitted, although the Germans were well advanced in ejection seat technology, but they didn't have an ejection seat fitted. But it was the performance that rattled us, because at this time, the end of the war, the top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14, with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When I tested the Me-262 at Farnborough, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour, 125 miles an hour faster than our fastest fighter. With this sort of fighter, you could conduct combat totally on your terms. If you didn't want to engage, you could go off and leave everybody standing. If you did want to engage, you didn't dogfight with a fighter like this. You made slashing runs at them, blasted at them with your 4 30mm cannon, and then got out of it. Of course, it was not meant mainly for fighter to fighter. It was fighter to bomber. And it had slight disadvantage here because, like us with our first jet, we'd forgotten one thing. That was how to slow them down. And we'd forgotten to fit dive brakes, and so had the Germans. So let's imagine this fighter taking on a B-17 Flying Fortress. It would come in at very high speed. Now, the 30mm cannon had an effective range of 650 yards, but it was inaccurate beyond that range. So you would close to 600 yards, open fire, but your closing speed was so high because you didn't have any air brakes that you had to break off at 200 yards in case you collided with a target. So you had a total firing time of 2 seconds. Now, in that time, you can only point your airplane at the target and shoot at random. If you had dive brakes, you could increase that time from 2 seconds to 4 seconds. And in 4 seconds, you can sight and fire. It would have made quite a bit of difference, maybe not a huge amount. And of course, later on, they introduced, fortunately, at the very end of the war, a fearsome weapon called the R4M air-to-air rocket. And this was fitted in racks of 12 under each wing. And I've seen a picture of it fired against a Marauder medium bomber. And when those rockets hit, 1 minute you have a bomber there, next minute you have confetti. It is just total annihilation. It really was fearsome. Now the Arado 234, different propositions, straight wing, same engines, but a reconnaissance bomber. But it was so fast, even with straight wings, that it could outrun any Allied fighter. And we know that it had taken, because we found the pictures, taken reconnaissance pictures over Great Britain, operating out of Norway. And it was that fast, as I say, it could fly in with impunity and take the pictures and get out again. Was beautifully streamlined and just a fine bit of wonderful construction. It was easier to keep serviceable than the Messerschmitt 262, and we flew the 262 a lot, but I tended to fly the Arado more because we were getting more information on the engine out of it. That's what we really wanted at that stage. The 163, in my opinion, at the end of the day, was a tool of desperation. It was not, I don't think, operationally effective. Its operational record is this. In its entire operational time, it killed 16 Allied aircraft for the loss of 10 of its own. But the other side of the coin was they lost over 40 with operational accidents due to the high volatility of the fuels used, which were extremely dangerous. It had, again, innovation was the name of the game here. You had swept wings on this. It was semi-tailless. It had a vertical tail, but no horizontal tail. It had elevons for both longitudinal and lateral control. It had a rocket motor, which was unique in this sense. Rockets have been tried in aircraft for years, both solid fuel and liquid fuel, but all had the same problem. When you lit the touch paper, you sit back and there's nothing you can do about it till it burns itself out. Here was a rocket produced which was throttleable. It could be throttled to either idle, cruise, or full power. It also had a skid landing, but the main problem with it was the fuels were incredibly volatile. Its main fuel was concentrated hydrogen peroxide. Now, I know nothing more explosive, with perhaps the exception of nitroglycerin, than concentrated hydrogen peroxide. And you had, under full power, 120 seconds of flight. That was all. Every landing was a dead stick landing. But you had to absolutely ensure that no fuel was left in the system. You had a jettison system on the aircraft, but sometimes it didn't work. If you landed with as much as a cupful of fuel in the aircraft, the impact of touchdown would cause a violent explosion that would destroy both the aircraft and the crew, the pilot, of course. So this was the danger. Another side of it was danger to the pilot in combat. When I flew the 163, I found that it had quite a comfortable pilot seat, and it had arms rather like these are, rounded. I thought this is very comfortable, but then I realised both these arms were hydrogen peroxide fuel tanks. And I said to the designer of the rocket, that is, Dr. Walter, I was in no danger of combat damage because I was flying it after the war was over, but what would happen if a bullet went through one of these tanks? And he said, well, we have done tests. And he said, even if you are using a non-organic suit, that if a bullet goes through and fuel leaks, it would take 9 minutes to melt the pilot. So that's the sort of horror side of that. And you can see where the accidents obviously occurred. Well, he was picked up by the Americans, so he wasn't in our care at all. But we, in the American occupation zone, they had a team doing precisely what we were doing in the Falcon mission. And in the whole of the American occupation zone, they hadn't a single Arado 234. And they were very keen to get one. So our government said they could have 2 from the lot at Norway, because we had almost a wing of them up there. So they were given 2. Then they came back to us and said, the Secretary of State said, we would very much like to have another 2. And I hummed and hawed over this purely as a game and said to them, well, we might be able to arrange it, but we would like a quid pro quo. And they said, well, what are you after? And I said, interrogation rights with Göring. So they started a hum and haw. Anyway, about a month went past, and eventually they came up and said, okay, it's a deal. And we gave them 2 more, and I got access to Göring for an hour. And would you like to hear about it? He was in a hotel near Luxembourg, under American captivity. And he was really being held there prior to the Nuremberg trials, which were approaching quite fast. Because I interrogated him, I think, if I recollect, it was the 16th of June, 1945. And I was given an hour, told I mustn't ask him any political questions because of the Nuremberg trials coming up, but I could ask him only aviation questions. Well, when he was brought in to the interrogation room, his clothes were hanging on him because the Americans had weaned him off drugs, and he'd lost a lot of weight. And he was looking po-faced, frankly, because I think he'd been interrogated up to here. And then the American invigilating officer, who had to be present during these interrogations, said to him, you're going to be interrogated for the first time by a pilot. And his attitude changed completely. He smiled, and he didn't offer to shake hands. Well, I wouldn't have shaken hands with him anyway. But he was very affable. And frankly, I found him a charismatic rogue, frankly. He was highly intelligent, there's no doubt about that, as he demonstrated at the Nuremberg trials. But anything I asked him, he would deliberate for a little while before answering, but answer direct, no shilly-shallying around. And maybe the key question that would interest people was I asked him what he thought the outcome of the Battle of Britain was, to which he replied that it was a draw. And I said, well, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And he said, well, if you look at the official casualty lists on both sides, he said, there isn't much between them. Now, that's not an unreasonable statement when you look at the casualty list. And he said, secondly, we withdrew. We were not defeated, we withdrew because Hitler ordered all the air units back to train for Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of Russia. Now, that is also factually true. Now, I would not like to tell the RAF that he had reached a conclusion which was not unreasonable, because clearly, as far as we were concerned, victory was 100% on our side. But his reasoning was not too bad if you consider it all. About 1947, I'd been at Farnborough by this time 3 years. I was going on my fourth. And I was beginning to think it was the end of the war and that I should be doing something. And Sidney Cam of Hawkers was interested in having me join the firm after Bill Humble retired. And I went for an interview with him, and we had more or less said that if I could get my release, this would be on the cards. So I then approached the Navy, and they said, oh, Farnborough says you can't be released. So I said, well, why not? And they said, well, you're engaged in one or two top secret projects, and they've got to be carried through to fruition. And I said, well, you really are penalizing me for this, aren't you? And they said, well, we will try and compensate you by offering you a permanent commission. And I said, right, I'm prepared to accept that. And it was as straightforward as that. I have always admired the US Navy with the way they use aircraft carriers. And I was at Farnborough at a very exciting time of carrier innovation, where we evolved the three major things. Firstly, there was the steam catapult, which could throw heavier aircraft off at much higher end speeds and with much less adverse acceleration on the pilot. In other words, with the normal cordite catapult, you went off, there was a colossal bang and you were a shock and then you were thrown off. With the steam catapult, you accelerate up to the max, so a max G. So it's quite comfortable. But the end result is wonderful. You get tremendous speed at the end, and you can take off much heavier weights. So that was a big innovation. And of course, it's using the ship's steam as the source. Secondly, of course, and above all, was the invention of the angle deck. Now that came about as a result of experiments done on what is called the flexible deck. This is landing an undercarriageless aircraft on a rubber deck. And we had a problem with getting the aircraft off the rubber deck in time to land on the next aircraft. So, ideally, you wanted a clear landing lane and a clear parking area, rather. And during conversation, while we were discussing this in general, the chairman of the meeting, who was a captain in the Royal Navy, happened to make a doodle on a piece of paper showing going off the angle. But it didn't occur to him. It must have occurred to him, but he didn't process it any further to the meeting. He just, left it. But sitting opposite him, thank God, was the head of the Naval Aircraft Division at Farnborough, who saw this, and it clicked with him immediately. This is a practical solution that could be actually incorporated in a carrier. That's how it evolved. And I was just about my time just after leaving Farnborough. The Americans had asked if I could go to America, to their test centre, Patuxent River. And Farnborough said, well, take the drawings and the details of the angled deck to them, and that'll be a nice introduction for you. And that's how it was. And of course, they were delighted and seized on it, and as only the Americans can do, worked with lightning speed to get it to be a practical idea. I had been in the jet flight, and it was all very top secret at this time, and the then boss of the outfit said to me, look, he was very interested in the Navy. I always had a good rapport with him. And he said, you should be thinking of getting one of these onto carriers. And I said, well, can I have a look over the stable to see what we've got? And there were 4 jets at the time. There was the E-2839, the Gloucester, our first jet, and there was only one left. So this was ruled out because it was really an engine test bed. There was the Meteor, which was twin-engined and really too big for the job. There was the Bell Era Comet, the American one, which we didn't want to touch because it was sluggish and it was their aircraft anyway. And then they left us with the only other alternative, which was called, at that time, the de Havilland Spider Crab, which became the Vampire. So that it was almost, if you like, Hobson's choice. And we selected that. The Vampire was a very, very docile aircraft, easy to fly, and all handling characteristics, very benign. So I thought there was no problem there at all. The only problem we had was at that stage in jet development, the acceleration of the jet engine and the deceleration was very poor. For example, it took on the aircraft that were fitted with British and German engines and American, all at that time we were all suffering from the same problem, slow acceleration. For example, the Meteor took 15 seconds to go from zero idle to full power. Now, in a deck landing, if you suddenly need more lift because you've let yourself get too slow, you need instantaneous lift, which you get from a piston engine aircraft with air screw. And throttle is... So what we wanted was throttle reaction on a jet like you have on a piston engine. That was inevitably coming, and in fact it only took about 9 months to come after we did the first landing. But our big boost to all this was we were going to beat the Americans to it, which we did by 9 months. huge advantage in the jet: view. You've no engine, propeller, and everything sticking out in front of you. Otherwise, the technique has to change completely in this sense. The essence of deck landing is lift control. And you get that on a piston engine aircraft by throttle movement. If you want lift, you just push up the throttle, the air screw will rev up, and you get lift from the wash from the propeller. If you want drag, which you do if you're getting too fast, you need drag, you just throttle back, the propeller finds up, and you get drag from the propeller. In a jet, the only way you can get lift is by accelerating and getting more speed, and the only way you can get drag is from air brakes. So it's different technique altogether. Well, at the end of the war, of course, everybody had to think again, and what are we going to do now? And the emphasis obviously went on to civil aviation. And the inevitable route at first was to civilianize military aircraft, like Lancaster was civilized into the Lancastrian, and things like that. The Wellington, the Warwick was civilized. The Warwick, rather, was civilianized. But we wanted a new breed of civil aircraft altogether, and our first one, which was the Avro Tudor. Now, Roy Chadwick, the designer of Avro, had designed a masterly aircraft in the Lancaster, and he designed the Tudor, and we expected the same sort of standard, and what we got was a grave disappointment. It was a very poor aircraft indeed. In fact, we reckoned it had 14 basic faults when it arrived at Farnborough, and some of them were dangerous faults. So the start was not good. But once we got into the swing of things, the Americans really forced ahead of us in this area, I think. And because they had really been preparing themselves for the end of the war a bit earlier than we had. The Russians weren't in the game because the Russians had built engines for combat aircraft with only a life of 100 hours. They reckoned there was no point in putting an elaborate engine into a combat aircraft that was going to be destroyed or wouldn't last much more than 100 hours. As a result, they finished up at the end of the war with no engines that anybody would dream of putting in a civil aircraft. So they were left at the post, so to speak. But our main fight was with the Americans in trying to capture the civil market. So we thought a bit slow off the mark until, of course, the Comet was devised by de Havillands, and this was moving into the jet side of civil traffic, and but then it ran into this disaster period, which set it back very heavily. But we did well, for example, on turboprops with the Vickers Viscount. We were making good progress generally, but I would say the accidents on the Comet set us back quite a bit, because the investigation as to what happened there had to be thorough and therefore took rather a long time, and that put the brakes on us rather badly. we had realized that here was a new environment for civilian passengers. They had always been taken through at low to medium level, and sometimes subjected to a fair amount of disturbance in low-level clouds, but nothing like the thunderheads you get up at high altitude. But when we reverted to jet airliners, they had no option but to fly at high altitude. So penetration of thunderclouds had to be looked at, but also a new phenomenon was occurring up there called clear air turbulence. This is when you are going along, visibility perfectly, suddenly you find yourself in very heavy turbulence because you are in a jet stream. And so that had to be investigated. Thunderhead penetration had to be investigated. And I think that's one of the most uncomfortable tests I've ever made in my life, was penetrating a thunderhead in a Spitfire. We chose a Spitfire because it has such structural integrity that it would be unlikely to break up in these things. But it is a frightening experience. You are tossed around like a little light toy. And in addition, you're getting the full visual entertainment. Elmers fire around the prop, lightning strikes on the fuselage, and lightning strikes that destroy your vision for looking at the instruments from dark suddenly to full light. And you really cannot control the aircraft as one does in normal conditions. All you can do is sit and try and keep the artificial horizon level. And you're at the mercy of the wind shears that are occurring in those thunderheads. And sometimes you find yourself going up at a rate of 1,000 feet a minute, and a couple of seconds later you'll be going down at a similar rate. It is a very scary thing. And of course, when you apply that sort of behavior onto an airliner, the structural demands on a civil airliner become huge. And I think the civil world, if you like, the aviation side of civil passenger flying, hadn't realized quite what they were up against at these very high altitudes.
During the Second World War, Churchill agreed with America not to make any brand new passenger aircraft until peace was declared. This understanding was known as the Churchill Memo. However, at the time, the US already had two advanced airliners ready to go. The Lockheed Constellation and the Douglas DC-4 were both purpose-designed airliners, which were quickly pressed into military service as transports when America entered the war. Both types were soon converted to civil aviation configuration when the war ended. This provided the United States with two well-developed airliners ready to sell to the emerging post-war airline market. On the other side of the Atlantic, Britain was not in such a strong position. However, the constraints of the Churchill Memo had one loophole. Passenger aircraft using a number of parts from existing bombers could be developed during the war. This gave Britain a chance to offer its own aircraft to local and Commonwealth airlines. Roy Chadwick was Avro's famous architect of the Lancaster bomber. The Lancaster's final incarnation was the Lincoln. Avro looked to Chadwick to transform these two military aircraft into Britain's first post-war long-range airliner, the Tudor. A policy of using existing parts was maintained as much as possible. However, as the final plans evolved, much of the expected commonality was lost. What did emerge was the Tudor Mark I, a substantial aircraft whose principal resemblance to its predecessors was the wing. This was sufficient to allow Chadwick to start work on the Tudor as early as 1943 without breaching Churchill's memo. Interestingly, the Miles Aerovan, a simple but effective light transport, which was being developed just prior to war's end, was halted when Miles received a rather curt cease and desist notice from the British government. Such was the power of the Churchill memo. The first flight of a Tudor airliner, GAGPF, was on the 14th of June 1945, just 3 weeks after the war in Europe ended. The Tudor employed a new pressurized cabin for passenger comfort. This would keep Avro abreast of the Americans, although the Tudor could only carry 12 first-class passengers against the competition's 40. But unlike the American aircraft with their modern tricycle landing gear, the Tudor still retained a tailwheel arrangement, making passenger access a somewhat clumsy affair. Still, the Mark I was up and running, and most importantly, available for the start of the expected airline boom. Britain did have a considerable aircraft industry left over from the war effort, and it was now looking for work. There had even been talk of the Tudor being assembled in Australia. The Tudor's future would be turbulent. One of the main problems was that the project had several masters: the manufacturer, the airline client, and the government. Almost the entire British aircraft industry relied on some sort of government funding, and the Ministry of Supply was heavily involved in many decisions. Here is the Right Honourable John Wilmot, Minister for the Ministry of Supply, admiring an early Tudor. He is in the company of Roy Chadwick and other Avro executives. The minister seems pleased and enthusiastic, which is perhaps not surprising, as he had been personally involved with the project even before the war was over. Now John Wilmot's interests were to see the Tudor project become a major success, both at home and abroad. It was well known that Australia, South Africa, and South America would soon all need long-range airliners. The minister's interest naturally extended to the factory. Wilmot is seen here walking below the Tudor's giant wings and the Merlin engines, both inherited from the Lincoln. Perhaps the team of onlookers had time to reflect that they were the only reason why Britain was able to have an international airliner ready to go just after the end of the war. Although only 16 Tudor ones would ever be produced, when it first rolled out of the factory, a celebratory flight seemed obligatory. It had clean lines, it was in the air, and it was all British. And what better an opportunity for the minister to confirm some official paperwork relating to the project. As the minister relaxes, he's able to gaze through the large porthole-like window, and where he is sitting, Mr. Wilmot would also be able to see one of the aircraft's controlling ailerons functioning on the wing. The portholes and the ailerons would soon play a different role in the Tudor's story. Right from the outset, Avro and the ministry had concerns about the Tudor one's shortcomings. Although the Lincoln model was a necessary starting point to build upon, it was hardly competition with the well-established Constellations and DC-4s. Tudor One didn't really have the range or the payload required for the all-important North American market. However, like the later Douglas aircraft, Tudor One could be extended and stretched into a longer airliner. Even before the Model 1 was completed, Tudor 2 was starting production, and none too soon, as both the advanced American airliners were starting to sell to overseas markets. To make matters worse, a third US contender, the Boeing Stratocruiser, itself a derivative of an Air Force transport, was in production and about to go on sale. The Stratocruiser was a luxury airliner with 2 decks, a bar and sleeping berths. Tudor II, with its extended front section, could carry 60 passengers and would be able to cater for long-range markets, although it still had some problems inherited from the Mark I. Nevertheless, in late 1944, before production had actually started, BOAC, South African Airways and Qantas had settled on the Tudor II. However, as the project grew, so did the problems, and there were no less than 300 technical modifications required of Avro. The early flight tests in March of 1946 had revealed serious stability problems with the longer aircraft. The previous neat tailplane had to be sacrificed for a much larger design, and then the original porthole windows were required to be changed for a more fashionable square style, which in turn required modification to the pressurized fuselage. All the modifications increased the overall weight of the aircraft, which then reduced its performance. The lack of performance particularly affected high-altitude flying in hot temperatures. During March 1946, the first prototype Mark II, GAGSU, failed its primary tests to the point that Qantas cancelled its order in favor of the Lockheed Constellation, and South African Airways changed to the Douglas DC-4. The result for Avro was a devastating loss of 50 orders. However, there was a still greater problem, though in fact it was more of a tragedy. On the 23rd of August 1947, GAGSU returned to Woodford Aerodrome and was serviced overnight. The following day, with Roy Chadwick on board, the aircraft took off and almost immediately faltered, then stalled, crashing into a lake on a nearby farm. Roy Chadwick was killed. Crash investigators discovered that the previous night, while being serviced, GAGSU accidentally had the control cables to its ailerons switched. As soon as they had been activated in the morning, the aircraft fell to its destruction, taking with it one of Britain's best aeronautical minds. From 1946 onwards, BOAC had been threatening to buy American. However, they finally, in 1947, did something quite different. They cancelled the Tudor IIs and instead purchased Canadian-built, pressurized DC-4s fitted with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The Canadians called them North Stars, and BOAC named them Argonauts. Later, BOAC would buy both Constellations and Stratocruisers. All told, only 38 Tudors were built, and only a few actually saw commercial service. Some were converted to freighters, and others to government VIP aircraft. Perhaps the most interesting were a small number that were converted to jet power as experimental aircraft. They were called Ashtons. They arrived in 1949, just 1 year after this aircraft, the de Havilland Comet.
From 1933 until the end of the Second World War, German aviation led the world in aerodynamic design and technical innovation. Long before the outbreak of hostilities, German industry produced an armada of technically superior warplanes. When war broke out, the Luftwaffe quickly overwhelmed some of Europe's most vaunted air forces. Classic designs like the Bf-109 fighter and Ju-88 proved to be superior fighting machines, while others like the Blumenvoss Bv-141 became one of aviation's true oddities. Germany's plan for war in Europe called for an air force that was to be used in direct support of its ground forces. The Luftwaffe's task was to sweep the skies clear of enemy fighters, then destroy enemy troops and installations. Key to the Luftwaffe's success were ground attack aircraft like the Henschel 123 and Ju-87 dive bomber. Ordered in 1934, the Henschel 123 proved to be a rugged and reliable aircraft. It would see service well into 1944. Ground attack was only effective when good battlefield observation and reconnaissance could locate enemy targets. That job was given to the Henschel 126, with its excellent low-speed short-field characteristics, an outstanding all-round view. The HS-126 proved a great success in the early campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The HS-126 would see action on every front, but by 1941 its limited performance was beginning to show, and a new battlefield reconnaissance aircraft was needed. This led to some of the war's most unusual designs. The Blohm & Voss Company was one of the first to respond with their BV-141. Designed around the concept of maximum all-round view, the BV-141 was in many ways a problem looking for a solution. The unorthodox design featured an asymmetric layout, with the radial engine installed at the front end of a portside tail beam, and an extensively glazed crew nacelle mounted to starboard. Unusual and radical in design, the BV-141 performed surprisingly well, but in the end it was considered too unconventional, and it was cancelled in 1943.
Yes, in my meanderings throughout Germany, just after the capitulation, I was looking for unusual or advanced technology aircraft. And the 141 intrigued me a little, but I had heard that at an airfield called Größenhain, which was quite near Meissen, there was a big reconnaissance unit which had many reconnaissance types of aircraft, and I thought maybe the 141 will appear there. So I flew there, and there was no sign of one, but I asked if I could speak to some of the POWs who were in the cage there, and one of the chaps told me that a 141 had indeed been there, but the last he remembered of it was not too long ago. It had had an engine problem while flying nearby and had landed on an emergency strip east of Größenhain. So I flew over in that direction looking for this strip, but it wasn't really a strip I found, it was a small airfield, and it was. By this time I'd moved into the Russian occupation zone, and I decided to land there because I had already found that at that stage after the war, the Russians were still very amenable to the Brits because we had come in at the early stages of the war to help them. Anyway, when I landed, there weren't a lot of aircraft there. And there was a Russian commissar and with an interpreter, and I asked if there was a 141 there. He didn't really know things like the aircraft numbers, but he said there were one or two aircraft left, but his people had examined the airfield, taken away what they wanted, and the rest was left for destruction. So I said, could I have a look around, see what there was? He said, well, yes, why not, because it's all going to be destroyed anyway. And in one hangar, there was indeed a 141. It had regularly had its engines run up by Feldwebel, who was available. And I said to him, was the aircraft flyable? And he declared, oh, yes, it was. I rather suspected his motive, so I wasn't too sure of what he was saying or believing what he was saying, because I think he had hoped I would fly him out of there and out of the Russian zone. But the Russians were obviously not going to play with that. Anyway, I thought I'll take his word for it and have a go at this. And the commissar didn't object. He said, as long as I stayed within sight of the airfield, and I'd only have enough fuel to do that, he didn't mind, because it was due for destruction anyway. And So he let me fly that, and I had about 30 to 40 minutes in it to try out this theory that it flew very nicely in a straight line when on an angle of bank of 90 degrees. And after about 2 or 3 goes at this at various speeds and heights, I had trouble with the engine. So I had to return to base. And so I formed an impression that it probably did what it said it could do. But its real reason for failing, in my opinion, was it certainly wasn't an aircraft in the same category of handling as the Focke-Wulf 189, which I had already flown and was its competitor.
Another odd-looking aircraft was the Focke-Wulf 189. The completely glazed central nacelle, twin engines and tail booms were considered too radical for conservative Luftwaffe officials. Performance, however, won the day. Known as the Flying Eye, the FW-189 proved supremely versatile, universally popular, and one of the most reliable aircraft ever to see Luftwaffe service. During combat operations, the FW-189 surpassed all expectations. Despite flying low over the battlefield and taking large amounts of damage, it had the ability to absorb punishment and fight another day.
So I think that killed it more than the theory that it gave the gunner a wonderful field of fire by having no starboard half of the tailplane and being asymmetrically offset to give a clear field of fire to the gunner. So that was my experience of it. Not very impressive, but interesting. The Arado 234 was a beautiful looking airplane. Aesthetically, it was very clean and looked dynamic, aerodynamically, very attractive. And cockpit was unusual. It was a glass cockpit right at the nose, and it reminded me, when I got into it, rather like being in a helicopter. You were stuck right out in the front there with completely clear vision around you. On the other hand, you were sitting pretty close to the accident if it had to happen too. And my first meeting with the 234 wasn't very happy a bit, because this was up at Grove in Denmark, where we found a number of 234s, and I had one prepared for a flight by the German crew, because we obviously didn't have the expertise to deal with it at that stage. And I taxied it out to the end of the runway. I was well aware, of course, that the Jumo 004 engines, so fitted to it, had a scrap life, total scrap life of 25 hours. So one really needed to know the service history of the engines you were flying. Now, the Germans were very, very adept at destroying documentation, and we could find no service records. Well, the Germans were very adept at destroying documentation, so we had no record. However, I taxied out to the end of the runway at Grosvenor and revved up to full power, ready for takeoff, and then just about to release the brakes when the starboard engine exploded and totally disintegrated, taking most of the starboard wing with it. And this, of course, could have been one of two things. Either the crew had sabotaged it, or it was an engine with 24 hours and 50 minutes on it. We never got to the bottom of what caused it, but suffice it to say that I must have flown something like 300 to 400 hours on the Jumo 004 in various aircraft, and never had another problem with it after that. So It did not give me a poor impression, the 234. On the contrary, when I flew it, it was a very nice aircraft to handle at a very fast turn of speed. It could fly it and cruise, and its top speed was 474 miles an hour, which was very high. And of course, it relied on this speed for its survival, because it had no guns fitted to it, and was purely a reconnaissance bomber as such. But as I say, handled beautifully. It was straight wing, was not swept wing, and made a very good impression.
The German Messerschmitt Me 262. Sleek, fast, and heavily armed, it was a quantum leap in fighter technology. For the Allies, the appearance of the new swept-wing fighter caused a great deal of anxiety and consternation. Nothing they had could come close to its awesome performance.
The top Allied fighter at the end of the war was the Spitfire Mark 14, with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. The Messerschmitt 262, which we captured and tested at Farnborough, had a top speed of 568 miles an hour, an advantage of almost 125 miles an hour, which means an aircraft with this performance, which is a quantum jump, can dictate terms of combat. It can initiate or finish combat as it wishes. It was a very formidable weapon indeed.
Considered by many to be the world's first jet fighter, it was in fact a distant second. Indeed, the first air-to-air kill credited to a jet fighter goes to the Gloucester Meteors of 616 Squadron RAF. On August 4, 1944, Flying Officer Dixie Dean, using the wingtip of his Meteor, toppled a V-1 flying bomb, sending it crashing into the ground. While the V-1 was a pilotless aircraft, it would still go down in history as the first jet versus jet encounter. It was a telling indictment. After a 21-month lead in jet fighter development, the Germans found themselves with just one design in production, the Me-262. By June 1944, only a handful were in service. But there was another jet fighter, one designed and built before the Me-262, the Heinkel HE-280. Designed by Ernst Heinkel, it was capable of over 500 miles per hour. At this late stage of the war, the HE-280 was nowhere to be seen. First flown in September of 1940, it was 2 years ahead of Willy Messerschmitt's Me-262. What happened? Was it simply indifference on the Luftwaffe's part, or was the promise of the HE-280 sabotaged by political interference, incompetence, or bitter personal rivalries? To find the answers, we must first look at the state of military aircraft design and production, beginning in the 1930s. Since the end of the First World War, aircraft engine horsepower steadily increased. At the beginning of the 1930s, new engine designs and the promise of the supercharger led to more and more horsepower. The new all-metal monocoque airplane revolutionized aircraft design. The possibilities seemed limitless. Speed, altitude, and range records were smashed. Military commanders saw great promise in these new designs, and as Europe crept toward war, orders for new bombers and fighters began to rise. With little time or money left for the development of any new or questionable propulsion systems, work focused on the evolution of the piston engine. Many engine builders called the idea of a jet engine the thing, technically unfathomable, and little more than a pipe dream. But there were those whose pipe dreams would become reality. In 1930, Flying Officer Frank Whittle, RAF, applied for a patent for his jet engine. This was followed by Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain and his secret jet engine patent in 1935. Robert Pohl, a colleague of Ohain at the University of Göttingen, was instrumental in bringing Ohain's invention to the attention of leading German aircraft manufacturer Ernst Heinkel.
This man, Pohl was the name, he wrote to Heinkel, whom he knew. And he said, I have a man here who was into something which I think has a tremendous future to it. He is into jet propulsion. It's a continuous combustion engine. It draws air in the intake, compresses it, and then the combustion cans are sprayed with gasoline, and it turns a turbine wheel to keep the thing running, and the exhaust comes out the half end of it. As long as you give it fuel, it'll run forever. And he says, I have a man here who wrote a thesis about this sort of application for a jet engine. It pleased me very much if you would meet him and see him and talk to him about his ideas and his applications for future aircraft.
With Heinkel's backing, the German inventor created a line of experimental centrifugal flow jet engines, similar to Whittle's, each with ever more thrust. The entire program was conducted as a private venture and in the utmost secrecy. The German Air Ministry was kept in the dark. On the other hand, Heinkel was also unaware that BMW was working on their own jet engine. BMW's design was an axial flow unit, more complicated than the centrifugal design. It offered more power and greater efficiencies. It was also being developed with the full knowledge of the German Air Ministry. In time, axial flow designs would power Germany's fledgling jet force.
Early in the days before, immediately before the war, the Germans had become aware of the practicality of a jet-propelled engine as being pioneered by Frank Whittle. And at first, they followed the same concept as Whittle of centrifugal flow, which is the simplest form of jet engine, really, and also probably the most reliable at that stage, certainly, in the pioneering efforts. But eventually, they turned quite rapidly after their first, if you like, experiments onto the axial flow type, which really offers many advantages. And they concentrated thereafter totally on axial flow engines. And within the limitations of the strategic materials they had, they were very successful in this. The only problem was that the axial flow engine is complex and therefore difficult to produce, time-consuming to produce. And also, unless you have the right strategic materials to contain the heat stresses, it can have a rather short productive life.
Work on a suitable test airframe for Heinkel's revolutionary new power plant was conducted at the same time. By August 1939, both engine and airframe were ready. Heinkel's HE-178 was no masterpiece. The short fuselage and stubby, elliptical wooden wings did not exude a sense of speed. On August 27th, test pilot Eric Melrose settled himself into the cramped cockpit of the tiny aircraft. Watched by Ernst Heinkel and a small group of mechanics, the HE-178 began to roll. The takeoff run was short. Climbing to 500 meters, Melrose circled the airfield once and came in for a perfect landing. Total flight time, 7 minutes. History had been made. Wasting no time, Heinkel telephoned Ernst Udet, the chief of aircraft procurement and supply at the RLM, the Reich's Air Ministry. The response Heinkel received was far from enthusiastic. The world's first jet would have to wait. On September 1st, Germany plunges Europe into war. Long before 1939, the name Heinkel had become a household name in Germany. Indeed, Ernst Heinkel's Flugzeugwerk had gained a worldwide reputation despite considerable restrictions placed on German aviation by the Versailles Treaty of 1919. During the 1920s and 30s, Heinkel produced a number of new military types for countries like Sweden and Japan. With the rise of Hitler in 1933 and the expansion of the new Luftwaffe, the opportunities for Heinkel seemed endless. Orders for fighters and bombers began to pour in. While many of Heinkel's designs, like the HE-111 bomber, were very good, they lacked what he desired the most: speed. Heinkel was passionate about high-speed flight.
Well, Heinkel He loved aircraft that flew fast. He wasn't all that into aircraft that were fighters, propeller-driven fighters and escorts and that sort of stuff, like the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt Bf 109. He was a man consumed by speed. The faster an aircraft knew, man, I'm for that.
Even before the first flight of the HE-178, he created the HE-176, the world's first rocket plane, in 1939. Unfortunately for Heinkel, official reaction was muted, and with the onset of war, all work on the project ceased.
Udet, Göring, and all those other people in the early Reichsluftfahrtministerium were propeller people. They believed airplanes that were driven by propellers and alternate engine systems. They said, no, an airplane flies best with propellers. And so Heinkel was looked upon as some kind of a crackpot. And the research he was doing on jet engines, they felt it was just silly and waste of money. And so he never got any real support from the Nazi government.
Shortly after Hitler came to power, a new requirement for an ultra-modern single-seat monoplane fighter was issued. Heinkel's response was the HE-112, powered by a 695-horsepower Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. Its direct competition was the Messerschmitt Bf 109 V1, also powered by the same Kestrel engine. The results were very close. While the Bf 109 was slightly faster, the HE-112 had a tighter turning circle and superior field performance. Amid general surprise and many raised eyebrows, Messerschmitt was awarded the new contract.
The Heinkel 112 was the better airplane as a combat airplane, and Rechlin test pilots endorsed that view entirely. So there was no doubt that from the pilot's point of view, Heinkel's 112 was number one.
For Heinkel, it was a bitter disappointment. It also marked the beginning of a new and rocky relationship between the aircraft manufacturer and the German Air Ministry. Undeterred, Heinkel continued with his quest for speed. Despite the lack of enthusiasm from Ernst Udet and later Erhard Milch, the State Secretary, Reich Air Ministry, Heinkel pressed on with his privately funded HE-280 twin-jet fighter. At the same time, the Messerschmitt Design Bureau completed a new twin-jet design study for the German Air Ministry. Submitted on June 7, 1939, the new proposal was accepted. On March 1, 1940, a contract for 3 airframes was awarded with the official designation ME-262. Simultaneously, and in the face of official apathy, Heinkel was rewarded with a similar contract. Even before the official contract had been signed, Heinkel had in fact cut metal on the first HE-280 prototype. The HE-280 was a quantum leap in aircraft design. Aside from the jet propulsion, the HE-280 was equipped with the world's first ejection seat and a tricycle landing gear. Prior to its first flight, a series of aerodynamic tests were conducted. Fitted with dummy engine nacelles, the prototype was towed into the air by an HE-111 and subjected to a number of gliding test runs. By March 30, 1941, the HE-280 V1 was ready for its first flight. With just enough fuel for takeoff, the HE-280 lifted into the air. After a single low-altitude, low-speed circuit, the HE-280 made a safe landing. It was the world's first jet fighter, but the world didn't take notice.
The Heinkel 280 was a state-of-the-art machine which no one really appreciated.
Just as the Germans were developing their jet technology, the Allies had their own secret jet programs as well. In England, Frank Whittle, like Ernst Heinkel, was battling against the same government indifference. The new jets were not a high priority. Frank's persistence, however, finally paid off. On February 3, 1940, the British Air Ministry issued Britain's first jet aircraft contract. Gloucester's aircraft was selected to meet specification E-2839. Design of this new aircraft was a collaboration between Frank Whittle and Gloucester Aircraft. The new E-2839 was a low-winged monoplane with the engine mounted behind the cockpit and equipped with a tricycle undercarriage, just like the HE-280. Air for the engine was drawn in from the nose and passed through ducts on each side of the cockpit. Like the Heinkel HE-178, the Gloster E-2839 was one of the world's first technology demonstrator aircraft. Its sole purpose was to flight test Whittle's W1 centrifugal jet engine, which developed a modest 860 pounds of thrust. A remarkable aircraft by any standard, 2 examples were built. On May 15, 1941, the first E-2839 took off from Cranwell Airfield at 7:45 p.m. The flight lasted just 17 minutes. The promise of Whittle's engine pushed the Air Ministry towards an operational jet fighter. Even before the first E-2839 took shape, specification F940 for a new jet fighter was finalized in December 1940. Because the new jet engine didn't have the required thrust, the new fighter would have to be a twin-engine design. The F940 was not a radical or advanced aerodynamic design. Following accepted aircraft practices, it was fairly conventional. On February 7, 1941, Glosters received an order for 12 Gloster Whittle airplanes to the F940 specification. These would become the first Gloster Meteors. Back in Germany, parallel work on the Me-262 was not proceeding smoothly. When the contract for the prototype had been issued, it was obvious to Messerschmitt that BMW had been unduly optimistic. The new BMW 003 axial flow engine was still unreliable, without sufficient power. It also had a substantially larger diameter. In order to accommodate the new larger engine, Messerschmitt had to completely redesign his original airframe. The new aircraft would be larger, with the engines housed in under-wing nacelles, just like the HE-280. While BMW struggled with their jet engine, the Junkers Aircraft Company was working on their own turbojet, the Jumo 004. This would provide a backup in case the BMW 003 failed. On November 1940, the Jumo 004 was bench-tested for the first time. Major problems were revealed, and just as the HE-280 V1 made its first flight, Messerschmitt's first Me-262 V1 was fitted with a nose-mounted Junkers Jumo piston engine. It was not the start Willy Messerschmitt was hoping for. On April 5, 1941, the HE-280 was officially unveiled. To impress his guests, Heinkel arranged for a demonstration between a Focke-Wulf FW-190A and the HE-280. During the mock combat, the HE-280 completed 4 tight circles before the FW-190 completed 3. Finally, Ernst Udet showed some enthusiasm. Top speed was 485 miles per hour, 77 more than the FW-190. Impressed, the German Air Ministry sanctioned the manufacture of 13 HE-280A pre-production aircraft. Unfortunately for Heinkel, mass production of the HE-280 was still out of reach. Heinkel now found himself up against personal rivalries, duplication, and incompetent leadership. To understand this state of affairs, we have to return to the beginning of the new Luftwaffe. After Hitler took power, he appointed Hermann Göring as leader of the new Luftwaffe. A World War I ace and squadron commander, Göring soon gave a number of his ex-squadron mates titles in the newly formed Luftwaffe. Ernst Udet was one of the first. Many had no experience in aircraft production, or had any business background. By 1941, German aircraft manufacturing was in a crisis. Under the command of Ernst Udet, aircraft production had stalled. For the first year and a half of war, Germany was only producing 800 aircraft a month. It wasn't until after the Battle of Britain and the setbacks in Russia did the German High Command take action. Unfortunately for Udet, he was unable to effect any real change. In November 1941, he committed suicide. Udet's successor was Erhard Milch. Milch was an able, ruthless administrator, but he lacked the military expertise necessary for the job. Although he had good understanding of aircraft production, He was unimaginative and a conservative when it came to research and development. July 18, 1942. The first Me-262 is ready for its first flight. Unlike the HE-280, the Me-262 is a tail dragger. Because of the nose's high angle, most of the jet's thrust is wasted. After a problematic takeoff run, it takes to the air for a short 17-minute flight.
When the Messerschmitt 262 was first tested, it was a tail dragger. It had a tail wheel. And the only way you could get the thing up and level was for the pilot to put on the brakes, and so the aircraft would come up level, and then they could take off with it.
Across the Atlantic, America finally enters the jet age with the first flight of the Bell P-59A. The date is October 1st, 1942. By the summer of 1942, the HE-280 was still very much in the picture. In June, the HE-280 V2 prototype was re-engined with two Jumo 004A engines, each rated at 1,852 pounds of thrust. Now, for the first time, both the HE-280 and the Me-262 are equipped with the same type of engine. Flight trials proved promising, with a top speed of 491 miles an hour being reached. A true comparison of the two fighters could now be made. Flight testing of the fourth Me-262 prototype showed that with the same power plants, it enjoyed a marked performance advantage over the HE-280. Compared to the straight-wing HE-280, the Me-262 looked faster. Its shark-like appearance and swept-back wings gave it a menacing presence. Even with this apparent advantage, the Me-262 still had a long way to go. For Heinkel and Messerschmitt, the road ahead was not a simple one. Both had suffered serious setbacks, their reputations now in question. In Messerschmitt's case, his new Me-210 twin-engine fighter was a complete failure. For Heinkel, the intractable problems associated with the disastrous HE-177 heavy bomber was a major distraction. By the summer of 1942, Germany was still victorious. After some unexpected setbacks in Russia, they were once again on the offensive. In North Africa, the First Battle of El Alamein began with Erwin Rommel leading the way. From a military perspective, Germany was at the height of its power, but it was now fighting on three fronts. Losses would be heavy. In September, the Battle of Stalingrad began with much promise. It was a bloody battle of attrition, and one in which Germans were losing. On November 1st, Allied troops break out of El Alamein. 7 days later, Operation Torch begins. Allied troops invade North Africa, with American and British troops landing in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel's fabled Africa Corps is now being squeezed on two sides. November 19th. Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus. Its aim: surround the city of Stalingrad and annihilate all German forces. The Soviet offensive is a spectacular success, and by the end of January 1943, the battle is all but over. The German 6th Army surrenders. It was the first Nazi acknowledgement of failure. In May, the battle for Tunisia is over. German and Italian forces surrender, with 250,000 troops taken prisoner. These military losses represented a key turning point. Germany was now on the defensive. For the Luftwaffe, January 1st, 1943 represented a time of crisis. Its operational strength had sunk to some 4,000 aircraft. It had also failed to introduce new, more modern types, aircraft like the HE-280 and the Me-262. In fact, the Luftwaffe was drawing on its last accumulated reserves. Contingency plans were non-existent. Any new military setback would be catastrophic. The German High Command had resolutely declined the possibility of waging a defensive war. From Hitler on down, the mantra had always been attack. The losses in Stalingrad and North Africa put a severe strain on Luftwaffe resources. For the first time, serious cracks began to show. But it wasn't just the losses in North Africa and Stalingrad that hobbled the once mighty Luftwaffe. The pre-war belief that Germany's military conquests would be short led to short-term planning. New modern aircraft wouldn't be needed. It was a strategic miscalculation, and one that had a direct effect on the development of Heinkel's HE-280 and Messerschmitt's Me-262.
Heinkel was up against the German Air Ministry, even though he had Ernst Udet as his very good friend and confidant. The German Air Ministry, they wanted a flying machine powered with like the Focke-Wulf 190, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109, that were designed for ground support, like in Poland and elsewhere.
For Heinkel, the battle for the HE-280 continued. As Germany's fortunes began to change, many still clung to the belief in a rapid victory, even in the second half of 1942. Erhard Milch was one of them. After Udet's suicide, he did manage to increase aircraft production, but at a cost. To avoid Hitler's wrath, Milch was unwilling to add any new types to the assembly lines. Doing so would cause monthly production numbers to fall. As a result, most of the pre-war designs remained in production right until the end of the war. Unfortunately for Heinkel and Messerschmitt, Milch's aversion to risk continued to have its effect in the one field where Germany could establish technical superiority: jet planes. In September 1942, both Erhard Milch and the German Air Ministry agreed. Any preparations for series production of the Me-262 would be premature, and in view of Heinkel's numerous commitments, production of the HE-280 was unrealistic as well. It was a curious point of view, but in early 1943, that all changed. In January 1943, Heinkel's HE-280 V6 prototype, powered by two Jumo 004 engines, took flight. For the first time, Heinkel pitched this version as a fighter bomber. In a complete about-face, the German Air Ministry changed its mind and began negotiations for the manufacture of 300 280s. It now seemed as if the 280 would finally see mass production and enter service before the Me-262. Ironically, the 262 V4 prototype, powered by the same Jumo 004 engines as Heinkel's new jet bomber, enjoyed a marked performance advantage over its rival. While the HE-280 was thought to be faster with a better rate of climb and ceiling, it only had two-thirds the range. In the end, the 262 was the superior fighter. In a letter dated March 27, 1943, Milch wrote to Heinkel, ending the 280 project. In Milch's letter, he claimed that the overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. For Heinkel, it was a bitter defeat. In a conference shortly after, Heinkel observed that Milch and his colleagues had a noticeable sense of unease about the jet, and the talk was always about jet bombers. For Willy Messerschmitt, victory over Heinkel would prove a Pyrrhic victory. Meanwhile in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor prototype DG-206 made its first flight. Like the Germans, British officialdom and industry were slow to deliver a reliable jet engine. Official confidence was shaken when the impellers on Whittle's WW2 engine continually burst at high speed. This was eventually remedied with imported impellers from General Electric, who in 1941 built their own jet engines based on Whittle's design. Fortunately for the program, Rolls-Royce was called upon to take over development and production of the W2B engine. Back in Germany, development of the Me-262 continued. Compared to the British, the German program was disorganized, inefficient, and veiled in secrecy, even from those who should have known. Surprisingly, Adolf Galland, general of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was kept in the dark. Not until May 22, 1943, did he fly the fourth 262 prototype. Galland was so impressed that he recommended production of the Bf-109 be halted and changed to the new jet fighter. Galland's enthusiasm swept away any remaining hesitancy and vacillation. 72 hours later, Erhard Milch ordered the 262 into series production. But many questions remained. Why did those involved in the program not see the value of the 262 sooner and act before Galland's endorsement? Why was it kept secret from Galland? And why didn't he fly the HE-280? One can only speculate as to what might have been if just 2 years earlier he had flown the 280. Finally, Messerschmitt had what he wanted, but there was one man who didn't agree. Adolf Hitler rejected out of hand any mass production of the Me-262. Said Hitler, "Nothing will be done with the new jet until I have decided on its merits." Unfortunately for Messerschmitt, the Führer was increasingly obsessed with revenge and retribution. Striking back at the enemy was far more important than providing his fighter arm with a fighter capable of defending the Reich. This would lead directly to Germany's third jet-powered aircraft, the V-1 flying bomb. Powered by a pulse jet engine, the V-1 was the world's first cruise missile and the first jet-powered aircraft to see combat in World War II. Shortly after D-Day, the V-1 bombardment of London began. To help counter the threat, the RAF deployed the first jet fighter, the Meteor Mark I. Compared to the HE-280 and the Me-262, the Meteor was slower, but more importantly, it was a combat-ready machine powered by centrifugal jet engines. Though the German axial flow engine offered more punch, Frank Whittle, the genius behind Britain's early jet engines, was sold on the reliability of centrifugal design.
Now, axial flow engines are much more complex than centrifugal, but much more efficient. Ideally, one should have headed for axial flow. But one has to put oneself back a bit in time and remember where we stood in the history of jet development, and that was not very far along the road. Whittle, quite rightly, when I talked to him, he knew all about axial flow, but I said to him, "Why have you gone this way, Frank, into centrifugal?" And he said, "Because in this present state of the art, I am looking for reliability and simplicity."
In November 1943, Hitler saw the Me-262 for the first time. Hitler scolded those in attendance, asking why, after years of demanding a fast bomber, was he presented with a fighter? Hitler wanted to know if the jet aircraft could carry bombs. Messerschmitt answered in the affirmative. For Hitler, the matter was settled. The Me-262 would be produced as a blitz bomber. In fact, Messerschmitt disobeyed Hitler and continued to develop his jet solely as a fighter. 6 months later, when Hitler found out, he flew into an incandescent rage. On May 25, 1944, he ordered all 262s to be built as bombers. It was a major blow and added more technical problems to an already troubled program. One of the biggest and ongoing hurdles was the development of the Jumo 004 engine into a reliable power plant. The Jumo 004 was an axial flow compressor design. In theory, it offered more power over the higher drag centrifugal compressor engines used by the British. In practice, however, the Jumo engines were considerably inferior. The shortage of strategic materials like chrome and nickel led to the failure of many substandard turbine blades at high temperatures. The Jumo 004 also suffered from decreased thrust at high altitude, fuel flow problems, and flameouts if the throttle was opened or closed too quickly. The Jumo 004 was a technical and operational failure. Not only did the Jumo 004 have a very short lifespan, it was unreliable, prone to surges, stalls, and fires. This was the Me-262's Achilles heel. One Allied pilots would feast on.
The engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, the designers had thought of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the 262s they picked off were usually in that phase of the operation.
By July 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was fighting a losing battle. Unable to cope with the swarms of long-range American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, it was quickly being destroyed. While the Me-262 was in production, the numbers in operational service were meager at best, and would remain so until the end of the war. The first American B-17 shot down didn't occur until August 15th. For the Germans, the situation was desperate. Shut out since the rejection of the HE-280, Ernst Heinkel was finally brought back into the jet fold. Concerned with the slow production of the Me-262, the German High Command wanted a so-called rush job, a single-engine jet fighter that required little strategic materials to build. For Heinkel, it was a question of pride. Eager to prove himself once more, he accepted the challenge. Heinkel quickly realized that in order for the jet to work, the engine had to be mounted just above the fuselage, similar to the V-1. 12 days after the specification had been issued, the HE-162 mock-up was ready. On September 23, 1944, Heinkel's HE-162 was selected for mass production. Captain Eric Brown recalls demonstrating the HE-162 to Heinkel in a post-war test flight.
He was like a schoolboy jumping up and down with delight, and asked very piercing questions about the handling of the aircraft. He had heard about the disaster we'd had with it. I found him with a very acute mind and struck me as a highly intelligent person.
By late 1944, the German High Command was fueled by fear, fantasy, and pathological denial. Galland said that the HE-162 was unrealistic. To mass-produce such a crude and untried aircraft and expect it to be flown by inexperienced Hitler youth was beyond reality. Even at this late stage of the war, Heinkel was working on at least 26 different versions. Using slave labor, 100 aircraft were produced in February of 1945. On February 6th, the first group converted to the new type. In the final weeks of the war, the so-called People's Fighter saw little action. Combat claims were made but never confirmed. Only one HE-162 was ever shot down by an Allied fighter. On May 5th, Germany surrendered. It was a crushing defeat. The new jet and rocket fighters introduced late in the war had no impact on the outcome. Many have argued that if the HE-280 had been produced sooner, history would have been different. Perhaps, but in the final analysis, the 280 wouldn't have made a dramatic difference. For Ernst Heinkel, there was a deep bitterness. His early groundbreaking developments were essentially ignored. As to who actually killed the world's first jet fighter, the answer is many. The HE-280 was quite simply a victim of mismanagement and industrial chaos. After 1936, Nazi management of the aviation industry was not centralized. Udet's technical office, Göring, the general staff, Milch, and all the aircraft designers jockeyed with one another for control of the aviation program. Instead of a uniform, consistent policy towards aircraft production, confusion and chaos reigned.
Göring must hugely accept blame for a lot of the failings of the Luftwaffe, particularly the delay and the mismanaging getting aircraft into production. And to a large extent, Udet was one of his causes of his problem. Udet was an extroverted, magnificent exhibition pilot in civil life, and he had been in Göring's squadron in World War I. Ernst Udet had no interest in politics, and Göring approached him as an old squadron mate and said, you know, the Nazi party needs you and your experience. Come in and be the head of our technical department. Udet was talked into this and was completely out of his depth.
Firms like Heinkel and Messerschmitt tried to build everything from trainers to strategic bombers. Every effort made by the Air Ministry to move them towards any specialization was effectively countered. Clear-cut technical objectives were never issued. Programs were allowed to continue regardless of the enormous waste in time, skill, and materials. Overall, the Nazi management of the aircraft industry was uncoordinated, inefficient, plagued by ignorance and incompetence. Even if the HE-280 had become operational in 1942, its overall effectiveness would have been limited. It all came down to the Jumo 004 power plant. Unreliable with a critically short lifespan, it was not ready for combat operations. Serviceability rates would have been low, as was the case with the Me-262. Finding good pilots would have been another issue. The number of newly trained pilots could barely keep pace with attrition. Fuel shortages also began to take hold. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was a dying force with no chance of recovery. As the world's first jet fighter, Heinkel's HE-280 was a marvel of technology and inspiration. Unfortunately for Heinkel, those in power saw little use for his twin-jet fighter. Hitler's reluctance to produce jets almost certainly doomed what little hope Germany had of ever producing an effective jet fighter force. As the Allies sifted through the spoils of their victory, the incredible technology left behind, they counted themselves lucky that Germany had recognized the potential of jet power too late.
The jets were left absolutely untouched. Now, I was puzzled about this, frankly. What had motivated this? It certainly wasn't because it was overrun too quickly for them to have got rid of these jet aircraft. I think, deep down, it was a sense of pride of what they had achieved in the technical field, and they wanted us to see it.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.